Hi, this is Paul J. Bennett, author of The Art of the Crown and the Frozen Flame series, and I'm here on Facebook Live today. I thought I would talk a little bit about fantasy movies, ones that I particularly like. There's actually a couple in here that I have to mention because they're so bad, or there's elements of them that are pretty cheesy, but I wanted to mention these. Now, as a disclaimer, I went pretty hard in terms of defining fantasy, so I'm not going to include animated movies in this, although there are, quite a number out there. I'm not going to mention fantasy movies that would fall into the range of superhero movies. That could be a whole podcast itself. And things targeted towards mostly children, such as Mary Poppins, Bednobs, and Broomsticks. Fine movies, just not what I wanted to cover in terms of a topic today. I'll also won't mention horror movies or their subgenres. I do like movies like The Mummy, for example, but technically that's a different genre. So I'm going to go start off. I decided to list them chronologically, and the very first one to start this off, you might not consider this a fantasy story, but here it is, one of my all-time favorites, The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, and this thing is in color. And Errol Flynn, what can I say? If you're looking for historical accuracy, this is not it, but very enjoyable movie. Errol Flynn's great, Olivia de Havilland, they teamed up in a number of movies, and Basil Rathbone makes such an excellent bad guy. He deserves a special mention. Now, back in the early days in the 30s, there wasn't really much in terms of fantasy. There were a few things like The Thief of Baghdad with Douglas Fairbanks Sr. And so on, but nothing that really sort of captured my imagination growing up. But this is a gem that I really liked. And by the way, this is the Blu-ray version, which is restored. The image quality on this is amazing. It's like it's a brand new movie. Once again, a little bit dated in terms of costumes and so on, but still very, very fun. This leads me to another movie, which is, you could classify as history, but since it deals with King Arthur, I would say that falls into the fantasy genre, and that is The Knights of the Round Table, 1953, with Robert Taylor. This is, once again, a bit dated. Some nice large-scale action sequences. The bad guys in this movie are a little, maybe one-dimensional. It is a bit dated, 1953, but still an enjoyable story. The year after, 1954, Alan Ladd, who was a pretty big star at the time, he produced, or he was in, a movie called The Black Knight, which is also kind of a fun one. And this story tells the tale of a smith who is eventually knighted. He falls in love with a noble's daughter, and so on. Once again, it's kind of got some stereotypes in it, and actually Basil Rathbone is in it again as the bad guy. Unfortunately, they have him playing someone of different ethnic persuasion, so that's a little iffy nowadays. Still an enjoyable movie, very campy. Guys running around doing all kinds of acrobatics and so on. Now, moving up in time to the next year, the early years, not really much in the way of fantasy, so I mean, Knights is pretty close to all we get. 1955, we get Ulysses with Kirk Douglas. Very interesting story. It tells, of course, the Greek tragedy. So you once again, you could sort of claim this is historical, but I mean, there are elements of magic and so on in it. So I decided to include it, and Kirk Douglas is good in this as well. 1963, one of my all-time favorite fantasy genre movies is Jason and the Argonauts. So this uses the special effects of Ray Harryhausen. I can still remember as a kid going to the public library to literally rent the reel-to-reel film of this to watch it. And it's got, the effects are a bit dated by today's standards. One of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is where Jason and his Argonauts, as the members of his ship, fight a bunch of skeletons, which were all animated. Very, very entertaining. Now, when we get into the 70s, we start getting into a series of movies, including some of the early Sinbad movies. Of particular interest, I might mention The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, which I like. It's got Tom Baker in it, who is more famous for playing Doctor Who. And so that's got some interesting things in it as well. And there's a number of other Sinbad movies. I only listed the first one. I believe it's the first one. I could be wrong there. And so it was quite entertaining. Moving that same year, actually, we've got the first of a series of books, or pardon me, movies based on classic books by Edgar Rice Burroughs. We have The Land That Time Forgot. And this has a lot of dinosaurs and so on. Once again, you know, doesn't age necessarily well for the special effects, but still quite interesting. Then we move into the 80s. Now, the 80s was a really good period of time for fantasy movies. We start to see the emergence of Clash of the Titans. Now, this is the original Clash of the Titans with Laurence Olivier and a whole bunch of other big stars. You have to watch these, if you're going to watch these movies, you have to take into account when they were made, because once again, the special effects, although good for the day, don't really stack up by today's standards. You're not going to see things like, you know, Lord of the Rings quality effects, but still an interesting story. They did remake Clash of the Titans. I kind of like the remake. I still like the original, I think, a little bit more, barring the effects, of course. But that was another one that I enjoyed. Now, we've got someone online here. Sandra Teagan is online. Good to see you. And a shout out to Jack. Nope, sorry. I've lost the page on my monitor here. Oh, Robert T, who dropped me a line. Apparently he prefers the written book over the ebook from an earlier episode. And I used to be the same way, but now you can make the font as big as you like in your EPUBs, and so I find it much easier to read. Anyway, let's get back to movies here. There's a number more that I want to speak to. In 1989, there was a movie that came out called Hawk the Slayer. Now, this is not what I would call one of the better movies, but you have to watch it if only to see Jack Palance at his cheesiest. He plays the villain in that show. He's marvelous in the part, in a role that really only Jack Palance could do justice to. The movie itself was somewhat forgettable. Still an enjoyable thing to watch, and it's one that I always think of, and maybe I'll go back and watch it. I don't know that it would age well, but certainly it was one that was up there. 1981, wow, two big movies this year that I really enjoyed. The first one was a Disney movie called Dragon Slayer, and Dragon Slayer, pretty typical story. You've got a village that sacrifices a young maiden to a dragon every so often, and a young man comes to the rescue. But the effects, the dragon in this was pretty incredible for the day. The other movie that came out that very same year is one of my favorite Arthurian movies, Excalibur. Now, Excalibur does not shy away from violence and his portrayal of nudity and sex as well, to a lesser extent. So it is a very gritty type movie, and here we have the typical knights with really heavy armor. And what's interesting about this is when you see them fighting, they're actually wearing themselves down. They're getting tired and bashing away at each other. Of course, it had a soon-to-be famous actor in it called Patrick Stewart, who played Guinevere's father. And one of my favorite scenes in that is when Arthur first shows up at his castle and helps defeat the invaders. There's a marvelous fight scene there. And lots of other fun stuff in that movie as well. The very next year, 1982, we had Conan the Barbarian, as only Arnold Schwarzenegger could play him. This has a lot of memorable quotes. It's really just Arnold rolling around, killing things with a sword. Still an entertaining flick, based on the Robert E. Howard books, of course. So, of course, you've got that classic storyline that he's pulling from. That same year, we also have something interesting, experimental if you like, The Dark Crystal. Now, the Dark Crystal, of course, uses puppets, but it does have a very immersive world with all kinds of interesting creatures. And of course, if you're paying attention on Netflix, they've launched a new version of Dark Crystal. I think my opinion of Dark Crystal is tempered by the time that I saw it, because I found that the new series couldn't hold my attention. Maybe I'm just past the point of puppets, I'm not sure. Or animated creatures, whatever you'd like to call them. So anyway, that came out in 1982. A couple years later, 1985, another movie. I remember seeing this in the theater and being very intrigued by it, and that's Ladyhawk. So in Ladyhawk, you have your typical star-crossed lovers, and they're being punished by a curse, and one of them basically, only one of them can be in human form at one time, and I forget which way it goes. One of them is forced to be a hawk half the time, and a girl the next. That's Michelle Pfeiffer's character, and Rutger Hauer is the other one who turns into a wolf. But they're on opposite shifts, kind of. So when one is a hawk, the other is human, and vice versa. And it also had Matthew Broderick as sort of a thief character. So that was very entertaining. It had some humor to it as well, and it was kind of a lower. I think it was a lower budget movie, but it was quite enjoyable. Then we move up into the 90s. Now there are a lot of other movies in here that I'm not mentioning because there's just too many of them to mention. But these are the ones that stick out in my mind, and I was going through numerous lists earlier today, trying to figure out which ones I wanted to include. So to start off. I have Dragonheart, and Dragonheart. Oh, sorry, I guess to get this out of order. But anyway, I'll talk about Dragonheart with Dennis Quaid. Very interesting story. A dragon gives up half of his heart to help a prince survive. He runs across another. I don't know if I'd call him a knight. He's a warrior. Dennis Quaid plays the part, and. I don't want to give the plot away. Very interesting story. Sean Connery did the voice of the dragon. Very, very good special effects for the day, and I think it would still hold up pretty well today as well. I haven't seen it in a while, so don't hold me to that. 1991. Let's go back to that for a moment, because another very popular Robin Hood movie came out, the one with Kevin Costner, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Now, I know a lot of people complained that Kevin Costner sounded too American, but to be honest, if everyone spoke like they did in those days, no one would understand them. I found it quite an entertaining movie. It took the old Robin Hood stories, twisted them a little bit, and I found it a very enjoyable story. Alan Rickman also, as the Sheriff of Nottingham in that movie, was exceptionally well done well cast in the role. Also that year, let me check my list here. We have another big movie for me, Willow. Willow was great. We have Warwick Davies as a can't remember what the race is called. He's like a smaller person, kind of a hobbit-like character, and he comes across a baby through various plot devices. And Laura Denon, I believe, is her name, and I can't tell you more without giving the plot away. It had Val Kilmer in it as Mad Mortigan. It had a number of fairly well-known actors and actresses in it. Very interesting plot. I'm surprised that they never came up with a sequel, actually, although I did see online somewhere that there was talk nowadays of actually doing a sequel of a grown-up princess and so on. Very entertaining story. Very high in the fantasy element, too, so it's more of a true fantasy, if you want to use that term. Moving on to 2000s. Oh boy. Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know if you've seen this movie, and I have to be honest, I played Dungeons and Dragons for years. Now, of course, we play our own version of a role-playing game. The movie was not the best. It had great potential. I think the people producing it, maybe the director, wasn't too familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, so it suffers. Its attempt at humor kind of fell flat, in my opinion. Some people really loved this movie. I found it was more of an example of what not to do when dealing with this kind of a movie. It's still sort of entertaining, but for me, it was more of a bad example. Of course, it pales in comparison to the two series that launched the very next year, because in 2001 we have the Harry Potter movies, which, of course, I love the Harry Potter movies. I read the books too. They were very well done movies, but I think for me it was overshadowed by the movies that came out the very same year, which was the beginning of Lord of the Rings. Peter Jackson's version of Lord of the Rings, starting with Fellowship of the Ring. He had to take some liberties with the story, which I understand. Having read Lord of the Rings, the first book can be quite tedious at times from all the traveling. That wouldn't necessarily, not that there's anything wrong with that in a book, but putting that into a movie, I think, would have slowed the movie down quite a bit. So I'm only going to mention Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings the one time, because there are, of course, multiple movies. I don't want to keep bringing up the same movie series over and over again, but certainly those are ones that I particularly liked. 2002 had another more of a pure fantasy movie, The Scorpion King. Now, this is based on a series I really enjoyed, the Mummy series with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. The first two movies were very, very entertaining. The Scorpion King was a spin-off, if you like. It had Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, in it, and this is one of his earlier movies. And the CGI is, well, actually, the CGI in this one wasn't too bad. The Scorpion King portion from The Mummy was a bit dated, but once again, you have to remember when these movies were made. 2004, we come up to King Arthur, the Clive Owen version of King Arthur, which I quite liked. Arthur and his knights really is a fantasy story, especially if you've read Le Morte d'Arthur. Now, this particular version tries to place it in a historical context, so it was actually more of a history movie, but still I found it was entertaining. It wasn't perfect, but their kind of take on Arthur, I thought, was very entertaining. And, you know, his knights, his people that followed him, I thought were particularly interesting. And just as a note, the character of Mads Mikkelsen, and I forget which character he played in that, but that was the inspiration for Gerald's character in the Heir to the Crown series. So I got that from that as well. Moving on, in 2005, I'm almost at the end of the list here, I don't want to keep you all day. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so this is referring to all of these. There's a number of them, of course. And these are the Chronicles of Narnia, I believe, is the actual title. They ended up making 3 movies. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and Prince Caspian. I may have the order out there. These movies I thought were quite well done. The effects were good for the day. They were entertaining. I think they were more youth-oriented in terms of the movie, which makes sense considering the source. But they just kind of petered out. I guess the box office wasn't there, and interest kind of waned after a while, which is unfortunate. It would have been nice if they could have made the rest of the series. I'm only going to mention a couple more. One of these is, once again, less of a fantasy and more of a historical movie, It's called Ironclad. It was made in 2011, and it stars James Purefoy. Now, James Purefoy plays a knight here. They're defending Rochester Castle. I found it very interesting, not because it's fantasy, but because it has a very sort of gritty look to the battle scenes, which I found quite interesting. Now, this is not a movie for people that don't like gore and such. And it's not technically fantasy, but I wanted to mention it because I feel like grittiness is missing from a lot of other movies. Lord of the Rings had it to a certain extent, but they were more focused on the higher end portion of the story. The last one I'm going to mention, also a trilogy, starting in 2012, we have The Hobbit. Now, I enjoyed the Hobbit movies. I'll say that right off the bat. I was a bit surprised when Peter Jackson took a very thin book and made it into 3 whole movies. But it's entertaining, and Smaug the dragon was amazing. Probably the best dragon I think I've seen. I like Smaug better than I liked the dragons in Game of Thrones. And by the way, I'm not going to mention Game of Thrones because technically that's a TV show. That'll be another thing to talk about at a later date. So these are the Peter Jackson Hobbit movies. Yes, he took a lot of license with the book, added a lot of stuff. I don't think he added anything that really hurt. He tried to put in sort of a romance with an elf and a dwarf. That's fine. It gives something for everybody. And there was a lot of more subplots added in as well. Still loved it. The Battle of the Five Armies. Love that scene, especially when you see the dwarves and the elves fighting together against the hordes of goblins and such. So I found that a very, very entertaining movie, or movies, since there was actually 3 of them. So what does the future hold? What am I looking forward to? That's a hard one to say. I do like the Marvel movies, of course. I'm not going to get into them because they're not my definition of fantasy here. They're a whole different genre. They're superhero movies, so I won't get into that. There is no movie that I'm aware of at the moment that's really sort of drawing me in. At least not from a fantasy perspective. I'm waiting for the last Star Wars movie, and I like science fiction as well. Maybe I'll do a Facebook Live on science fiction movies at some point. But since I'm writing fantasy, I figured this was probably a better way to go. Let me just check my Facebook feed. Do I get anything else to mention here? On the Facebook feed, we've thrown in the list of the movies with some dates on it. So if you want to check that out, you can. Now, once again, there are many other movies that could fit into this category. Off the top of my mind, I can think of things like The Never-Ending Story. Once again, in terms of that particular movie, I found that to be more of a children's story, so I didn't include it, although I did include the Narnia Chronicles, which some would consider to be children's stories as well. So that's it for this Facebook Live session. Next time we get together, we'll be on the break between New Year's and Christmas next time. And I'm going to talk about fantasy series. Do we have a question or something?
Someone wants you to talk about your favorite fantasy books.
Oh, my favorite fantasy books. Wow. Wow. That's a whole nother podcast or a Facebook Live session. So we'll put that on the docket. Next Facebook Live, I think I'm going to be talking about TV shows, believe it or not. There's some pretty obvious ones like Game of Thrones, but there are some other ones that might surprise you. Once again, I'm going to have to stretch it a little bit to include some pseudo-historical, because there's a fantasy element to many of those. And, if you think of Robin Hood or Hercules or Xena or whatever, these are all going to fit in there as well. And of particular interest are some of the English series as well. Now, I have, at home here, we have Netflix, we have Amazon Prime, we have Crave, we have Disney+. Crave, by the way, is a Canadian streaming. Includes a lot of other movies and so on. And we have, Amazon Prime, Disney+.
Apple Plus.
Oh, Apple Plus is another one, although I don't think there's any fantasy there. And so I'll be talking about series. Pardon?
C is on Apple Plus. C.
Oh yeah, that's a fantasy too. Wow, there's all kinds of ones back there. Now I'll have to put some qualifications for that too, because there's a lot of science fiction shows that could fit into the fantasy genre. So I'll have to limit the choice a little bit. Otherwise, it's going to go on forever. I don't want to hold you guys up for an hour talking about this stuff. So until next time, enjoy your holidays, and we'll see you on the break before New Year's.